all the very best. All the very best, only good health and Atzlacha Rabbah, and enjoy your wonderful children and grandchildren and whole family. Okay, Ellie.
I'm just going to mute you and mute everyone, and Rabbi Kimche, please unmute yourself.
Right. So we are back to the Shia. Nice to see everyone here. Shirley March, nice to see you and your husband as always. Very nice to see you here in this Shia. And Judith is back with us. Nice to see you, Judith, and Hadassah Fuchs. We've got some real, some important regulars here. And Family Shaman is joining us as well. Nice to see you. Nice to see you here. The downside of Zoom shiurim is one loses out a little bit on the personal contact. That's why I try and mention the names of some people here that we should feel that we're actually all sitting together in the same room virtually. You know, at least we've got the Zoom. At least that is a nechama to us. Imagine the whole COVID drama without the Zooms and the videos would really be pretty horrendous. You know, we have children and grandchildren in America we haven't seen in 2.5 years, and I still can't get there. Waiting for an opportunity to go there. Okay, Rabbi Say, ladies and gentlemen, we're looking at Sefer Bereshis, and we're looking at it from a particular point of view. And the point of view is one supplied by Chazal, the Ramban, other Mefarshim, that actually Bereshis contains within it the shoresh, the roots of pretty much everything that happens to Klal Yisrael in the course of their history and in the Torah. And it's not just a story of the Ovos, but it's actually the DNA of the whole of the Tanakh in many ways. And I'm going to be looking at, we're looking at Bereshis chapter 14 in Parshas Lech Lecha, and the story of Avram and Lot. That's what we looked at last week. And if you remember last week, I gave half of the Shia on the name Yerushalayim. And if somebody would ask you, where's Yerushalayim written in Bereshis, right? The answer is, how could Yerushalayim not be written in Bereshis, right? Yerushalayim that plays such a crucial role later on in the history of Klal Yisrael ad hayom hazeh. So we looked at the Chazal that Yerushalayim is actually, the Medrash says, a combination of Malki Tzedek Melech Sholem, that's the Sholem of Malki Tzedek, added to the Hashem Yireh of the Akedah. So Akedah and Malki Tzedek together, really, in other words, each of them, well, let's put it differently, neither of them were teaching the full teachings of Klal Yisrael going forward in the Torah, but together they gave the full message of Yerushalayim was a combination of the Torah of Malki Tzedek, who was Shem, that's the Beis HaMedrash of Shem Va'ever, and the Torah of Avraham Avinu that was Hashem Yireh, that's the Yirah. Ata Yodati Ki Yireh Elokim Ata, the Yirah Shamayim of Avraham Avinu and the Sholem of Malki Tzedek combined to make Yerushalayim. Just reminding you what we looked at last week, because I think that's a really magnificent insight into this magic name of Yerushalayim. And as we all know, excuse me, the name Yerushalayim itself doesn't appear anywhere in the Chumash. It appears in the Tanakh hundreds of times, but in the Chumash it doesn't appear anywhere. The Torah does, however, make multiple references to Yerushalayim, but it uses a different word when it wants to refer to Yerushalayim. What word does it use? Anybody know? What, for 5 points? What word does the Torah use as a code word when it wants to refer to Yerushalayim?
Is it possible? Hamokom Asher Yifrach.
Hamokom. Thank you very much. Who said that?
It was Chava.
Chava. Hi. Chava, nice to see you. Nice to hear you. I can't see you, but I can hear you. Chava, not surprisingly, Chava knows the answer. The word ha-moko. The Torah uses the word ha-moko, right? When the Torah, for example, gives us the mitzvah, one of the Tariq mitzvahs of Aliyah L'Regel, of Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, it says, Shalosh Pa'im B'Shana, Yeroah Kol Zechurcha, Ba-mokoim Asher Yibcha Hashem Elokecha. The place, ha-moko, the place, right? Also, when it speaks about the Sanhedrin, it says, "V'kamta over Oliso el Hamokaim," to the place the Sanhedrin were housed in the Lishkas Hagozis on the Har Habayis. So whenever the Torah wants to tell us a halacha about what would eventually be Yerushalayim, it uses the word ha-mokam, the definitive place. Why doesn't it actually designate the word Yerushalayim? That's something of a discussion among the Rishonim. The Rambam, for example, in Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam discusses this question. He's a bit bothered by this. Why wouldn't the Torah mention the name Yerushalayim, since it clearly existed already at the time of the Chumash? So he says the Torah didn't want it to be identified so clearly, because otherwise there would have been a machlokas, a big machlokas among the different tribes when Yeshua divided up the land. There would have been a machlokas who would get that portion of the land which contained Yerushalayim. So in order to avoid that machlokas, in general, if you look in the book of Yeshua, Yeshua spends 28 years conquering and settling the land. So the Pasuk says the first 14 years, he was fighting against the Goyim. He was fighting against the Canaanim and the Chittim and the Amorim. He was actually engaged in warfare. And the next 14 years, he was dividing up the land among the 12 tribes. Let me ask you a question, Rabbi. So what was more difficult for Yeshua, fighting the Goyim or dividing up the land among the tribes of Israel? I must be honest with you, I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. I think fighting the Goyim was a piece of cake compared to convincing Zevulun to live here and Yisachar to live there and Reuven to live here and Yehuda to live there. That must have been quite a drama. And it took him the same amount of time. It was 14 years to fight the battles and another 14 years to divide up the land. So this was the Rambam writes in the Moreh Nevuchim that had Yerushalayim been specified as Hamokam Hashem Lekecha, then it would have been even more difficult to convince different Shvatim that someone else is going to get that portion and not them. And therefore it was that's why it wasn't mentioned. But the Remez, Medrash tells us that Remez is already in Sefer Bereshis with the Sholem and the Yira. And it works so beautifully in terms of the letters of the word Yerushalayim, right? That the Vav in the middle of the word Yerushalayim is actually the Vav HaChibur. It's the Vav which connects. It connects the Yira to the Sholem. And that is that's the key to Yerushalayim. That's what we were looking at briefly last week. It's a much bigger subject, of course, but maybe for another time. Let's go back now to the Psukim in Bereshis chapter 14, Parshas Lech Lecha. And there are one or two very, very interesting details in the story of Avraham Avinu going into battle. Right? It's interesting that we don't actually find either Yitzchak or Yaakov going into battle, actually arming themselves and going to fight, right? Although Yaakov does say to Yosef, but that is it's a problem in Chazal. Why would he say that I conquered it b'charbi or b'kashti when we don't find that he did any battles which were fought with the sword and with the bow and arrow? We don't find that. Al kol panim, Avram certainly did. What sort of army did Avram have? How did that work? And what are the hidden references in that particular story? I'm going to share a text with you now, and let's have a look. Okay, 1 second. Some reason. Seconds. Okay. Second. Share the screen. Get the right screen up. There we go. Okay. Can you see a screen? Everybody can see a screen? Yeah, thank you very much. Just checking. So what happens is Avram receives the news that Lot, his nephew, has been captured in the battle between the 4 kings and the 5 kings. The 4 kings were victorious, and he is now a prisoner of war. So what happens here? So here's the passage that we're going to look at now. Vayishma Avraham ki nishba Achiv. Avram heard that his Achiv literally means his brother. In this case, it means his nephew. Achiv was a general word used to mean his relative. And nishba, of course, the word known to us also in modern Hebrew. Nebuch, soldiers who are taken captive in war, are called the shvuyim. Shvuyim are the captives. Nishba Achiv, that his brother, his nephew was taken captive. And the Torah here uses an unusual word now. Vayorek es chanichov. Yelidei beso shemona meos shemona also shalosh meos vayirav adam. Okay, so here's the pasuk. So what does it mean by Yorek es chanichov? A bit of a mystery here. The English translator here takes the pshat that he mustered his disciples. It's an interesting word, the word chanichav. We use it today to be a chanich, right? To be a chanich is to be a, what's a good translation of the word chanich in the way it's used in modern Hebrew? Youth movements tend to use it a lot. The chanichim means the kids who are participants. But of course, the word chanich comes from the word chinuch, comes from the word education. Let's have a look. Let's have a look what the Mefarshim do with this. So let's start with Rashi. So Rashi here says somewhere, right? So Rashi says first of all that vayorek is a word that we don't know in Hebrew, but so Rashi says ketargumo. The way to understand it is through the Targum. The Targum uses the word v'zoriz. So we know the word zariz. Zariz means to speed or enthusiasm, or to enthuse people, to make them move fast. Lezarez is to motivate people. So by Yorek as Chanichov means he got them moving. And Rashi brings 2 other psukim, one in Vayikra, one in Shemos, where the word in Vaharikosi eschem, Vaharikosi achrechem, cherev, that the sword will run after you, right? As Dain Bacharbi Alechem Bachen Orik Charbi. That's a pasuk in Oz Yoshir. In Oz Yoshir. Orik Charbi. So Orik there is a reference to this idea of something happening quickly and to be highly motivated. I think Orik Charbi in the Oz Yosher is a reference to what Paro is saying. Paro is saying, I'm going to arm myself, I'm going to pursue them, and I'm going to destroy them. Right? That's Paro's intention in just before, prior to Kriyas Yamsuf. I remember 20, 30 years ago in Israel that this pasuk was used as a reference to one of the most famous generals in modern Israeli history, right? This was Arik. Anybody remember Arik? Arik Sharon. Arik Sharon, one of the most famous generals in early history of Israel. Sadly, he eventually made a massive error in the disengagement from Gaza at the end of his life, and so he's remembered not positively, but actually as a general, he was fantastic. As a prime minister, he was not very good. We find that a few times that people think that because they're good generals, they will be good prime ministers. This is rarely the case. The skill set that you need as a general is a completely different skill set needed for a prime minister. And the transition from general to prime minister is actually not a healthy one. Anyhow, coming back to our pasuk, so Rashi says that Orik, we're going to see that Chazal learn the word Orik completely differently. Rashi is giving us Pshuta Shal Mikra. Let's have a look at other Rashi on Chanich. Let's first have a look at Vayorik. Here's a Gemara in the Dorim. Can you see here this Gemara in the Dorim? where the Gemara says, "Vayorek es chanichav yelidei beisa." What does it mean? It was discussed by Rav and Shmuel. In other words, the early generation of the Amoraim, like in the 3rd century in Bavel, when they were learning this pasuk, there was a debate between Rav and Shmuel. Rav Omar shehorikon ba'Torah. What does that mean? That Vayorek means horikon ba'Torah, right? So it could mean there could be two opposite meanings here to horikon ba'Torah. It could come from the word rake meaning empty. Horikon ba'Torah, that he emptied them out of Torah. In other words, he disturbed their Torah learning. What were his disciples doing? His disciples were learning Torah from him. They were sitting and engaged in spiritual activity. We don't even know really who these people were, right? These were his disciples. He had no children. We don't know exactly much about the people who had joined his camp, but whoever they were, they had joined him for spiritual reasons. They were his spiritual followers. And what he did was, he took them out of their spiritual studies or spiritual meditations, whatever it was, whatever spiritual goals they had wanted by joining Avram's house, he disturbed them. He disturbed their spiritual activity in order to mobilize them for battle. So Rav actually uses the word horikon ba'Torah. According to one interpretation in the Rishonim, it's actually a criticism of Avraham Avinu, that he did something not so good. He disturbed their spiritual growth by forcing them to join the army, right? A bit like taking boys out of the yeshiva and forcing them to go into the army, right? Which is one of the hottest issues in Israeli society. So here, you could learn, Rav says, by Yorek is Chanichov, that actually is a criticism of Avraham Avinu. Other Mefarshim, other Rishonim on this Gemara say that Horika, if you have a look here in the English translation supplied by a Safaria, somebody might be familiar with this Safaria online, he translates that Horikon means, look at this, he showered them with Torah, like someone who pours from one vessel to another. In other words, he gave them an important lesson in Torah. And what is that? The lesson in Torah he taught them was that pikuach nefesh takes precedence over whatever else you're doing. Whatever else you think you're doing in terms of spiritual activities, the importance, right? The immediate importance of saving Lot's life takes precedence. So that was a special practical shia that he was teaching his students. So Horikon could be Shehorikon ba'Torah in a positive sense. So you have here, it's very interesting, you have here in Chazal these two different nuances about Avram. I don't think there's any doubt here that Avram did the right thing, and that clearly he did take with him his colleagues in order to go and fight this battle. But there is a possible critical element here that he took people who had followed him in order to gain a spiritual life, and instead of which he mobilized them for military activity. Okay. Shmuel Omar, the Gemara tells us there was another view that Shmuel says, Shehorikon bazahov, that he showered them with gold. And again, in the Rishonim, we find two different, the Ran says here, Horikon bazahov, he paid them well to be his, to accompany him into battle. He made it worth their while. Other Rishonim here say that he gave them a lot of gold in order to join them, in order that when they go into battle, they shouldn't be motivated looking for the spoils of war. In the ancient world, soldiers went into battle, generally speaking, their main motivation wasn't patriotism. Their main motivation was that there was always spoils of war to be gained, right? And what he wanted here, eventually, Avraham realized that eventually he wasn't going to take any of these spoils of war. So he gave them in advance enough gold. So that's what Shmuel says, Horikon Bazar. So it's interesting that Chazal, the Torah uses a word which is an unusual, unique word, like this word here, by Yorek Eschanichov. It's open to lots of different meanings. But what's fascinating about Chazal is that all these different Perushim all coexist here in this pasuk. One shouldn't view it as a machlokas, but it's also true that he disturbed their spiritual work. It's also true that he taught them a practical lesson in Pikuach Nefesh, right? It's also true that he needed to pay them to fight for him. And it's also true that he wanted them to avoid spoils of war. In other words, all the different Perushim of all the Rishonim here all accumulate to give us a fuller picture of what's going on. Who were these people? So the Pasuk tells us, unusually, the Pasuk tells us a number, and it's a bit of a strange number. Shmona osa or shlosh me'os. Why would the Torah tell us a number like that? I mean, there are lots of battles taking place throughout the Tanakh. We don't find that we're told that Yoshua went into battle with 3,964 people. We're not told to the last individual the numbers of people going into battle ever, right? Especially a number like 318 seems to be a bit of a random a number. Except that many of us have learned Rashi, and Rashi brings down this Gemara, which is the Gemara in Nedarim Daf Lamed Beis, that actually 318 is a gematria, right? And it's a gematria of one man, and that is, it's a gematria of the name Eliezer. That's what the Gemara here says. The Eliezer, the gematria of Eliezer is 318, right? And the Lamed and the Reish, the Lamed and the Ayin is 100, the Reish is 200, that's 300, and the Zayin Yud Aleph is 18. So 318 of Eliezer. So basically all he took with him was Eliezer. According to this Perush, that all he took with him was Eliezer, the meaning here of this Chazal is that the entire victory that Avraham had over the four kings was completely supernatural. I mean, for two men to take on an army, not just an army, but an army of four warrior tribes who had just now been victorious over the other 5 warrior tribes. So we're talking about a serious fighting force on the other side. If all he did was taking Eliezer, then the whole episode is a nace, is a miracle. And the truth is, even if it's not just Eliezer, even if it's genuinely 318 people, it's already a nace. It's already miraculous. And if it is miraculous, it raises an interesting question. There's an important question here to be asked, which some of the commentaries look at, and that is, why did Avraham do this? Here is Avraham Avinu living in Eretz Yisrael. He's got lots of followers. He's teaching Emunah, he's teaching Chesed. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has told him that he will be Av Hamon Goyim. He's got lots of disciples. He's doing what he's supposed to be doing. Lot, on the other hand, is the rebel. He's the nephew who went off the derech. He's the nephew who abandoned Avraham and instead chose the flesh pots of Sodom. And Sodom was famous for selfishness and egoism and promiscuity and even perversion. And it was really Midas Sodom is one of the worst things Chazal say about people. To have Midas Sodom is the height of egoism. And it is, in fact, the mirror image, in many ways, very interesting. You know, sometimes in Lahavdil general literature, authors in literature give you what literary critics call a point and counterpoint. In other words, they have somebody who represents a certain way of life, and they introduce into the drama somebody who is the exact opposite and who embodies the opposite, exactly the opposite of everything that the hero represents. That's a well-known mechanism in literature in general, a point and counterpoint in literature. And here you have that between Avram and Sodom. Sodom represented the diametric opposite of everything that Avram represented. Right? If Avram represented Emunah and Chesed, Sodom represented paganism and selfishness and egoism and greed. And Sodom are the anti-Chesed, right? There's an interesting, just by the way, it's interesting in halacha, that there's an interesting principle that of somebody of Zeh Nehene V'Zeh Lo Choser. Some of you who've learned Gemara will have come across this phrase in a situation where one person stands to gain a lot, and the other person, even if he is the owner, that he stands to lose nothing, right? So, for example, somebody has a building which is lying empty, lying completely empty, and he has no plans to rent it out or to sell it at all. He's bought a building because he wants to sell it in 10 years' time, and it's standing completely empty. And somebody else comes in. This is the halachic equivalent of the modern idea of squatters. Somebody else comes in and he squats in the building. He squats in the building. He lives in a building which isn't his, right? But the owners, and he doesn't deny that the owners are the real owners, and he has no intention to steal this building from the owners. He's just saying, look, these owners are currently doing nothing with it. I'm currently homeless. I'm going to pitch up my home inside this empty building. And the Gemara asks the question, has the owner got the right to enforce his ownership, his bailus, and throw them out? Is he allowed to do that? So the Gemara says, for the owner to do that is midas Sodom. It's midas Sodom, because you have a situation where the squatter is sitting in your building, and zeh nehene v'zeh lo choser. The owner doesn't lose out anything by it at all. He wants to leave this place empty, and the squatter is benefiting. He's got a roof over his head. So on what basis are you going to throw this person out? Only on the basis that you want to enforce your ownership, right? That is midas Sodom, says the Gemara. It's zeh nehene v'zeh lo choser. I must tell you, just by the way, Tosfos there writes, in Bava Metzia, Tosfos there writes that if the squatter damages the building, even in the slightest way, then he is liable for full rental, not just for full damages, but in other words, he's only allowed to live there on condition that he absolutely does no damage whatsoever to the property, and that as soon as the owner wishes to sell or to use the building, he leaves happily. But if he's willing to abide by those conditions, it's zeh nehene v'zeh lo choser. That is midas Sodom. Midas Sodom. So the Gemara says, excuse me. The Gemara says, can the Beis Din enforce this? There's another interesting question in halacha. Can Beis Din enforce that the owner allows the squatters to stay? And the Gemara says, yes, kofin al midas Sodom. The Beis Din are allowed to legislate against midas Sodom. If one party stands to benefit and another party stands to lose nothing, then you're only enforcing your rights on the basis of pure selfishness. Pure selfishness. That is considered halachically to be midas Sodom. So Sodom in Chazal was this epitome of greed and selfishness, and I can see that Yudit is saying something, but I can't hear what you're saying. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Now, my question is, when Lot originally chose to go there, he saw this beautiful place in the valley. He'd never been there. That he didn't really know. He just saw the physical beauty, but maybe he didn't know about the whole. And after he got there and he got acclimated and this and that, then he what could you say?
So first of all, I'm always happy when somebody wants to be counsel for the defense of Lot. You want to be counsel for the defense and say that he was unaware of it, but that's not the case. When Lot makes his decision, the pasuk there tells us, "V'anshe Sodom ro'im v'chatoim laHashem me'od." That's what the pasuk there says. At the time Lot makes his decision, and the implication is that Sodom had a reputation to be ro'im v'chatoim laHashem me'od. That is an excessively negative description, and certainly the assumption of the narrative of the story is that Lot was aware, but we accept your limud zechus. We accept your limud zechus in the spirit of which it's given, that you want to defend Lot from that accusation. But you should know that generally in halacha, I can't resist telling you a little footnote of an interesting anecdote that happened to me in one of the big dramas of my life. Those people who were with me in London will know that one of the biggest dramas of my life was the London Eruv controversy. Elian, you remember the London Eruv controversy? Yes. Danny, you remember the London Eruv controversy? I think one or two people here listening know about the London Eruv controversy. And one of the interesting halachic questions that came up was, if within the Eruv area there is a community or a group of people who refuse to accept the Eruv, right, and who refuse to participate in the Eruv, can they invalidate the whole Eruv? In other words, the whole Eruv relies on the fact that everybody within the perimeter of the Eruv actually jointly accepts to acquire a peruta worth a chelek in the Eruv Chatzeros. In other words, what happens is you make an Eruv, which is the boundary perimeter of poles and wires, and then you take a box of matzahs, and symbolically you say everybody within the Eruv acquires one fraction of this food, and this food is what's called the Eruv Chatzeros. It unites everybody within the Eruv, and that creates the halachic reality of the Eruv. I'm, of course, oversimplifying and overgeneralizing criminally by saying all this, but that's basically the general idea, right? What happens if a group of people stand up and say, we are not going to accept any part of this Eruv, we are militantly against it, and it could be that they would break the whole Eruv, and therefore an Eruv would be impossible. This was a question that bothered me for a few months. You can see that I got over the problem eventually, but how did I get over the problem? When I was in Eretz Yisrael, I went to visit one of the Gedolei HaPoskim, Rabbi Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg, Zeichat Tzaddik Livracha, who was the author of the Shilas and Tshuvas, Tzitz Eliezer. The Tzitz Eliezer Tshuvas run to about 23 volumes and are one of the most well-used modern Shilas and Tshuvas, halachic responsa of the 20th century. Right? The Tzitz Eliezer had an amazing power of psak halacha, and he was a member of the Beis Din Ha'elyon, the Supreme Court in Yerushalayim, and was a very, very interesting, deep thinking Litvish Don. And I went to speak to him, and I went to discuss with him this and some other problems about the Eruv at the time, questions that were being raised, these were all technical questions about the halachas of Eruv. And he spent a lot of time with me on it, and he was very fascinated by it. Why am I mentioning all this? Because on this question about whether a person or a group of people within the Eruv could refuse to break the Eruv by simply refusing to accept part of the Eruv Chatzeros, he said, on this question, the poskim say, Koifin al midas Sodom, that the Bezdin can enforce anybody within the Eruv to accept a kinyan on that small amount inside the Eruv. Why? Because it's zeh nene v'zeh lo chosa. The others are all benefiting, and this person doesn't lose out by the fact that there is a kosher Eruv. He doesn't lose out. He might decide not to avail himself of the Eruv. He might decide not to use it, and that's fine. But he doesn't lose out that there is, that the Eruv exists, and in actual fact, he gains by it because maybe his wife or his children might inadvertently once carry or not know Hilchas, or they might think that sticking your handkerchief up your sleeve is a way of carrying something without an Eruv, and they're wrong. So the Eruv saves them. So in other words, there are some benefits, even for people who don't want, for various reasons, the Eruv to go up. But he paskan the halacha of kofin al midas sedai, to want to break a benefit to other people and you gain nothing by it. That is a midas sedom. And in actual fact, at the end of our talk, he said, do me a favor, write me down your shilas, and I will answer you a written answer, and then we'll publish it in the next volume of Tzitz Eliezer. And indeed, in volume 17 of Tzitz Eliezer, if any of you are ever in a library of shilas and tshuvas, and you go to Tzitz Eliezer volume 17, there is one of his tshuvas there is Be'inyan ha'eruv belanda, and it's addressed to me, and the opening line is, my good friend Dayan Chanach Ehrentreu has sent me a rabbi, Rabbi Kimche, to ask me the following questions about the London Eruv, and here are the answers. It's a very and in it he writes about Midas Sodom. Anyhow, it's interesting how the Sodom became not just a part of the narrative of Bereshis, but it became an interesting principle in Dinei Mominus, in the halachas of Shulchan Aruch, and widely applicable up to and including Hilchas Eruvin and in other places. So Sodom represented the mirror image of Avraham Avinu. Coming back to my question on Parshas Lech Lecha, here is Avraham Avinu basically risking his life, going into battle in order to save Lot. And Lot is the man who has rejected everything Avraham Avinu ever taught him and has decided to go, instead of living with Avraham Avinu, he's decided to go and live in Las Vegas, right? So why is Avraham actually going into battle at all? This is a fascinating question. Has anybody ever heard any answers to this question? Anybody can think of any answers? Why would Avraham Avinu have gone into battle at all? Certainly, if it's just him and Eliezer, he's relying on Nissim. On what basis would he have decided to make this decision? Do I have any offers on this? So it's not an easy question to answer. It's one of those interesting questions. And in actual fact, if you look at the list, the Rishonim make a list of the 10 nisyonos, what were the 10 tests that Avraham Avinu went through. Some of the Rishonim mentioned this battle as one of Avraham Avinu's tests. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was testing him whether he would indeed go into battle to save Lot, and he did. He passed the test. So what is this about? Why was this? So there is a Kabbalistic, more mystical answer to this question, which is mentioned here by the Malbim. Well, the Malbim says that in the Kabbalah we find that the following rationale given to Avraham Avinu, that Avraham Avinu had a Ruach HaKodesh, had a type of a nevuah. And in his nevuah, he saw that even though Lot in the here and now was a rebel and he'd gone off the derech, he contained within him, right, the DNA, the nitzoitz, if you like, a spark, which would eventually give birth to Moav, a descendant of Lot, who would give birth to Rus, who would give birth to David HaMelech. That he sensed that Lot, the rebel, Lot, the person who had abandoned him for the terrible materialism and egoism of Sodom, nevertheless, going forward centuries, contains within him the potential to give birth to David HaMelech and Malchus Beis David through Rus HaMoyaviyah. Right? Don't forget, Moav was a son of Lot, right? Moav was his son. So therefore, there's a direct line from Lot to, says the Malbim, Al Pi HaKabbalah, that was Avraham Avinu's motive. He knew that Lot in this generation was an Oisvorf, right? He was somebody who had completely departed from the way of Emunah and Chesed and chosen the opposite. But nevertheless, there was in him in the future, there was something wonderful to be preserved. This in itself is a very interesting way of looking at people, even people who are in the here and now, somehow have a certain negativity about them. We believe that actually within their neshama, there is a potential going forward, maybe not in this generation or the next generation, but at some point in the future, something wonderful will come out. And that is a perspective, a very important perspective to have generally about members of Klal Yisrael. And that's what it says in last week's Parsha, when Moshe Rabbeinu kills the Mitzri. It says, "Vayifen kovacho, vayar ki ein ish." Vayar ki ein ish. He saw there was no. So the Poshup Pshat there is that he saw that that if he didn't intervene, nobody was going to intervene. Here was the Egyptian this Jewish man to death. No one was going to do anything. And we all know the principle is, b'makam she'ein ish, hishtadel liyaz ish. If there's no one going to do anything, you stand up to do it. So that's the Pasha Pshat. But what does Rashi say? Does anyone know what Rashi says? Vayaki ein ish. The Rashi says that Moshe Rabbeinu saw prophetically that even were this man to live, nothing good would ever come from him in future generations. Vayaki ein ish. That's more of a mystical, prophetic insight. So similarly, Avram had with Lot a mystical, prophetic insight that yes, something wonderful would come from Lot, and that was David HaMelech. And therefore, that motivated him to go into battle in the here and now. So that is one answer, which is very interesting. However, there is another answer, which I want to look at, which is given by the MS Liyakov, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, Zeichot Tzadik Libracha, one of the great Gaonim of the previous generation, in the MS Liyakov. So he says that if you look carefully at the Psukim, when Lot leaves Avraham Avinu, what does it say? It says, maybe I'll see if I can get the text up here. Maybe I can get the text up here. And it's going to take a minute because I haven't got it. Okay, let me just take a minute, see if I can get up the text. 1 second, bear with me, ladies and gentlemen. Say here when okay. Okay, let me just get back. I'll get back to my screen now and do a little bit of screen sharing. See if we can get that. There we go. All right. Can you see something on the screen? Right. Let me just... Okay, so when Lot says, I'm going to leave you, so Avraham says this. Right, this is in chapter 30. He says, Hello, Kol ha'oretz lefonecha. The whole land is before you. Hipored no me'olai. Let's separate. Im hasmol ve'emina v'im hayomin ve'as me'ila. If you go north, I will go south. If you go south, I will go north. That's what the translator translates. Not sure why the translator says north and south. The pasuk says left and right. Okay, I don't know. If you go left, I'll go right. If you go right, I'll go left. That's what the pasuk says. So have a look in Rashi. Rashi brings us Chazal, and this is the important piece for Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky. So Rashi says here, Bim hasmol ve'emina, Rashi says, B'chol asher teishev, wherever you choose to live, lo esrachek mimcha, I won't be far away. And I'll be there to protect you and help you. And we see in the end that Lot needed him. Okay. So what do we see here? So what did we see here? Did you see that text? Yes, you saw that text inside? Yes. So what do we see there? Says Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, according to Chazal, when Avram says to Lot, he's saying to him, you go left, I'll go right. But even when you leave me, I'm not going to leave you. You can leave me, but I'm going to stand by you. Even if you, wherever you decide to go, I'm going to stand by you. You're my nephew. And if you want to, we can factor in what I said earlier in the name of the Malbim, that Avram had a nevuah, that even if he's a bad person in the here and now, he has a potential good within him going forward in later generations. So he says to him, I'm going to always be there. Says Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, Avraham Avinu gave his word. He gave Lot a promise. The promise was, I will be there for you, lemogein u'le'ezer, says Rashi. I'll be there to help you and to protect you. Right? Now, Lot is a prisoner of war, and in order to save him, Avram is going to need real supernatural nisim. Nevertheless, Avram goes into battle to do what, says Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky? To keep his word. To keep his word. In other words, and this is a much more of a broader theme, and I want to next week, please God, I want to have a chance to look with you at a very, very important piece of text from the Netziv. The Netziv is one of the very important 19th century commentaries on the Chumash. The commentary is called the Hamekdava, right? And in it, I'm just giving you a bit of a preview, a trailer of this Netziv. The Netziv says that the real essence of the Ovos was to teach us morality, to teach us yashrus, right? In other words, he brings a Gemara, which we'll look at, please God, next week. The Gemara says that the Ovos were the Yeshorim. Another word, the Gemara uses the word Yeshorim. Yashrus means integrity, honesty, and morality. That in actual fact, the Ovos did not yet have the Torah, but they had emunah, and they had chesed, and they had a deep moral sense. And one of the main goals, says the Netziv, of the whole of Sefer Bereshis is to teach us the levels of morality and integrity that the Ovos possessed and taught, right? On that basis, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky writes, one of the principles of integrity and honesty is to keep your word. If you've given your word, you have to keep your word. Even if seemingly the battle against the four kings in a natural world was hopeless. It was heavily outnumbered. Nevertheless, to keep your word, you do the most amazing things. And you get siyata d'shmaya. If you've given your word, you keep it. So here he says that the Netziv, I just want a couple of words about the Netziv, but we'll pick this up again, please God, next week. But the commentary of the Netziv on the Chumash is a masterpiece called the Hamekdava. Not that it needs really my haskama, by the way, but I'm just telling you that it's something which is very enjoyable. It's never been translated into English, but it is a very remarkable work. And the Netziv, in fact, played a very important role even in Jewish life going forward, because he was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Volozhin Yeshiva. And the Volozhin Yeshiva in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, it closed in the 1890s. But for about 50 years, the Volozhin Yeshiva was the engine room for the yeshiva world. And out of the Volozhin Yeshiva, it actually gave birth to lots of other yeshivas. Most of the other literacy yeshivas, like Ponovich and Mir and Telz, were all spin-offs of the Volozhin Yeshiva. So the Volozhin Yeshiva was the most important in terms of the Litvish yeshiva world. The Volozhin Yeshiva was the mother of all yeshivas. And the Netziv was the Rosh Yeshiva. He was the person who took over the stewardship of that yeshiva. In the, I think, 1840s, he took it over. He was married to a granddaughter of Reb Chaim Volozhin, who was a Talmud of the Vilna Gaon. And the goal of Reb Chaim Volozhin started the Volozhin Yeshiva, and his goal was to take all the hashkafa and the Torah of the Vilna Gaon and to create an institution that was dedicated to teaching that hashkafa, that perspective on life. So the Volozhin Yeshiva really embodied the writings, the teachings of the Vilna Gaon, and the Netziv is an acrostic. Nun Tzadi Yud Beis is Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. His name was Berlin, and his name was Naftali Tzvi Yehuda. And he was the Rebbe of many Gedolei Yisrael, including, incidentally, Rav Kook. Rav Avram Yitzchak Kohen Kook, the famous Rav Kook, who came to Israel in the early 20th century. Where did he come from? He came from Volozhin. And in Volozhin, his Rosh Yeshiva was the Netziv. And his love for Eretz Yisrael, he got from the Netziv. The Netziv gave him his love for Eretz Yisrael, so much so that actually when his firstborn son, when his son was born, when Rav Kook gave birth to a son, he called him Tzvi Yehuda. Tzvi Yehuda is the name of Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. He called him after his Rosh Yeshiva. He called him after his Rosh Yeshiva, the Netziv, who really had taught him his Torah, he taught him his love for Eretz Yisrael, he's taught him his love for Klal Yisrael, and so Rav Kook really brought with him into Eretz Yisrael some of the Torah of the Netziv, and he took it forward to the next generation. But there were many other Talmidim, actually, from the of the Netziv. Maybe I'll mention them in next week's shir. But next week I'd like to learn with you the introduction of the Netziv to Sefer Bereshis. And the upshot of it is that when we're learning Sefer Bereshis, we are learning, if you like, what Rabbi Kamenetsky calls Derech Eretz Kodmo La Torah. That before Torah could be given, there had to be established on planet Earth somewhere a group of people committed to Derech Eretz. And in this sense, Derech Eretz means morality, integrity, and honesty, yashrus. And that is one of the most important principles of the whole book of Bereshis. The whole book of Bereshis in many ways represents that principle. Says Rabbi Kamenetsky on Parshas Lech Lecha, one of the most dramatic examples of the morality of Avraham Avinu is having given his word to Lot, even though Lot didn't deserve it. Lot's behavior did not deserve that Avraham Avinu should be so loyal to him. nevertheless, having given his word of loyalty to Lot, he was willing to risk his life. And think about it, he's risking his life, he's risking the life of all his followers, he's risking his whole life's goal to be Av Hamon Goyim, to give birth to Klal Yisrael, right? The whole future that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had promised him, he was willing to risk in order to keep his word. Once you've given your word, you keep your word. And therefore, one should be careful before giving one's word. But Abraham had promised him, and to fail to keep his word for Avraham Avinu was unthinkable. Why? Because that was the essence of Avraham Avinu and the others, that they were the Yesharim, that they wanted to teach us this principle of Yashrus and of honesty and integrity. And therefore, we've got here an interesting little episode in Parshas Lech Lecha of Lot being taken captive, saved by Avraham Avinu, and then restored to his previous home. But in the course of that whole episode, we learn something very important about Avraham Avinu and about his moral commitments, about the way in which he is going forward as one of the Yesharim, right? And the Netziv says, we find the word Yesharim, funnily enough, with Bilam. Bilam says, Tomois nafshi mos Yesharim. I'd like to, and to which Chazal say that he'd like to die the death of the Ovos, that he uses the word Yesharim as a reference to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. In other words, he didn't want to live like the Ovos, he wanted to die like the Ovos, which is an interesting thought, incidentally. There are people like that. They don't particularly want to live a life of Yirah Shamayim and Emunah and integrity, but they'd like to die a person of integrity and morality. And that's Bilam. Tomois nafshi mos Yesharim, right? He says, and the word Yesharim there is a reference to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and that is an extremely important principle. It's worth learning and teaching the whole Sefer Bereshis just to extract from it the moral principles and the Yashrus of the Avos. And on that basis, to understand how they did, what they did and how they did it. Okay, that's it, Rabbi Sai, for today. A little bit of an excursion into Parshas Lech Lecha. It's nice to see you all here on our Tuesday morning Kviyas. Nice to see you, Phil and Lisa. Nice to see you back with us. Nice to see both of you. Hope all is well with you and the families. And to see Malcolm here and Danny. Nice to see you here.